There's a quiet kind of story hidden beneath the ones people rush to tell. It lives in the soft spaces between breaths, in the small choices no one notices. Tonight I want to share one of those stories with you, a story about a boy who once stumbled into a kind of tenderness he never expected. Long ago, when the world still felt too wide for him to understand, he followed a faint humming down a hallway cluttered with tools, glass jars, and the scent of copper and dust. The sound was low and steady, like a heartbeat pressed against a pillow. He paused, heart fluttering with the uncertain wonder that only comes in the pause before something new begins. He stepped into his grandfather's workshop, where shadows stretched across piles of half-finished inventions. Lanterns glowed faintly green, casting circles of light on the worn wooden floor. In the corner, balanced on a folded blanket, sat an egg the size of a melon, veined with silver light. It pulsed softly as though breathing. The boy tilted his head, not daring to touch, half convinced that if he blinked, the thing might vanish and leave only silence behind. For a long moment he simply watched, letting the strangeness settle. The egg seemed alive but not threatening. Its glow was calm, almost inviting, as though it had been waiting for someone patient enough to notice. He crouched closer, feeling the way his own breath matched the rhythm of its faint shimmer. He thought of all the stories his grandfather used to tell about hidden corners of the universe, places where new life could arrive when no one was looking. Perhaps this was one of those quiet arrivals, secret and shy. His fingers hovered above the shell. The surface felt cool, smoother than glass, and beneath it something shifted. A ripple of movement, quick and delicate. He drew his hand back, startled, then smiled despite himself. It was a good kind of surprise, like opening a window and finding a morning mist where you expected sun. He sat cross-legged on the floor, studying the object from every angle, wondering if it needed warmth or if the hum was enough to keep it safe. The boy stayed there for what felt like hours. Sometimes he spoke softly, unsure if words mattered to a sleeping thing, but wanting to offer company just in case. He told it about the day outside, about the drifting clouds and the way the wind had smelled of rain. He confessed how often he felt too small for the world, how sometimes he wished someone would tell him where to go, what to be. The egg did not answer, but the gentle pulse of light seemed to listen. When the workshop door creaked open, his grandfather leaned in, eyebrows raised above tired eyes. He glanced at the scene, boy and egg, light pooling at their feet, and let out a slow breath. "Some things," the old man murmured, "arrive before we know how to hold them." He didn't explain further. He just crossed the room, placed a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder, and gave a nod that felt like permission. That night the boy lay awake, turning the moment over in his mind like a smooth stone. He thought of how easily he could have walked past the hallway, how close he came to missing the sound entirely. Maybe, he decided, the universe sometimes whispered to those who were still enough to hear. And though he didn't know why, he felt a small promise settle inside him, that he would keep watch over the mysterious egg, at least until it revealed what it wanted to be. Days folded softly into one another. After school, he would drift back to the workshop, clearing a little space around the blanket, sweeping away sawdust so the egg could rest undisturbed. He learned to read the subtle flicker of its glow, to notice how it brightened when the room was quiet, or when sunlight touched it through the high window. Sometimes he traced tiny circles on its surface with the back of his fingernail, humming half-forgotten tunes without thinking. It was the kind of care that asked for no applause, the simple companionship of one living thing keeping company with another. There were moments when doubt tried to edge in. He wondered if he should tell someone else, or if he was foolish to believe in something so strange. Yet, every time he considered stepping away, he remembered the way the light had steadied beneath his breath, how the workshop felt less lonely when he was near. That feeling, gentle, steady, anchored him. He didn't need to understand everything. He only needed to be present. On the seventh evening, as twilight soaked the edges of the sky, the boy entered the workshop to find the glow stronger than before, a silver halo spilling across the floor. He approached slowly, heart tapping at his ribs. The egg quivered once, then twice, like a sigh after a long sleep. A faint crack traced itself across the surface, delicate as spider silk. He froze, breath held, unsure if he should call for his grandfather or stay silent. A soft sound came, not quite a chirp, not quite a sigh, but something in between. The crack widened, revealing a glimpse of pale green light within. He felt the tug of awe, quiet and deep, the way one feels when seeing the first star on a still evening. Whatever rested inside was alive, and it had chosen this small room, this ordinary boy, as its witness. He knelt close, speaking in the calmest voice he could find. "Hello," he whispered, unsure if he was greeting a creature or a dream. The shell trembled again, releasing a warm breath of air, scented faintly like rain after summer heat. The boy stayed still, steady as stone, waiting to see what would emerge. Somewhere beyond the walls, night gathered, patient and kind. The workshop lamps glowed softly, catching in the silver veins of the egg. The boy's eyes stayed fixed on that thin line of light, his heart unfolding like a quiet flower. He did not rush the moment. Whatever waited to be born would come in its own time, and he would be there, ready, listening, as small keeper of a mystery that was already teaching him how to be gentle. The shell yielded at last with a faint sigh, folding back in thin, translucent petals that caught the light like morning dew. Inside lay a small being, curled and trembling, its skin the pale green of new leaves. Its eyes blinked open, wide and silver, reflecting the boy's face as though studying him in return. He felt something quiet settle between them, a bond forming before either could give it a name. The creature gave a soft sound, somewhere between a yawn and a question, and stretched tiny fingers tipped with almost transparent claws. They looked sharp, but moved with the hesitancy of something unsure about its own edges. The boy swallowed, heart steadying as he reached forward. The creature did not pull away. Instead, it tilted its head, leaning slightly into the warmth of his palm. The texture of its skin surprised him, not slick as he expected, but soft, like velvet warmed by sunlight. A flicker of delight passed through him, mingling with an unfamiliar tenderness. Whatever this was, however impossible, it was also fragile. He understood, without needing to reason it through, that its safety now depended on him. He gathered a few rags from a nearby shelf and folded them into a nest, arranging them carefully before setting the newborn inside. The creature let out a satisfied sigh, curling against the fabric as though it had been waiting for that small kindness all along. The boy sat cross-legged, unable to look away. He wondered what his grandfather would say, whether there were instructions hidden in one of those old notebooks, or whether caring for something new always began in uncertainty. The old man eventually appeared at the doorway, eyebrows raised but not unkind. He peered at the small bundle, then at the boy, and gave a thoughtful hum. "Looks like you've made a friend," he said softly, placing a gentle hand on the boy's back. There was no scolding, no warning about rules broken or risks taken, only a quiet acceptance, like a lantern placed just far enough ahead to light the next step. That evening after supper, the boy returned to the workshop with a small bowl of water and a scrap of bread soaked in milk. He wasn't sure if the creature could eat, but he felt better having tried. The little one sniffed at the offering, then turned away, nestling deeper into the cloth. Perhaps, the boy thought, it needed nothing more than rest for now. He stayed until the lamps burned low, humming a tune he half remembered from childhood, watching silver eyelids drift closed in sleep. Days moved gently forward. The boy gave the creature a name, Z, because the sound felt easy, like a breeze slipping through an open window. Z learned to focus those luminous eyes, to follow the boy's movements with an alert curiosity. Sometimes it stretched its limbs, testing the strength of muscles, still learning their shape. Other times it simply dozed, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm, as if teaching the boy that care could be a quiet thing. Caring became a ritual stitched into ordinary hours. After school, he would slip into the workshop, replace the rags with freshly laundered cloth, and sit beside the cradle while telling Z about the day. He spoke of passing clouds, of the laughter of classmates, of a bird that had landed on the windowsill during math. Z listened, or seemed to, tilting its head and blinking in slow, steady intervals. Though it never spoke, the boy felt heard in a way words rarely offered. One afternoon he dared to lift Z and cradle it against his chest. The creature shifted slightly, then settled, small body warming the boy's arms. He felt the faint thrum of a heartbeat beneath thin skin, steady and sure. It struck him then that love didn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it was just the willingness to hold another being with care, to let them lean against your heartbeat while they learned the shape of their own. On the 7th day, Z surprised him by mimicking the sound of his hum. The note was higher, wobbly but clear, and it made the boy laugh aloud, a sound freer than he had heard from himself in months. The workshop seemed to brighten with it, dust motes spinning in the lantern glow like slow sparks. He felt, for the first time in a long while, that perhaps he belonged somewhere, even if that place was simply here, sitting on a wooden floor with an alien child in his arms. That night, as shadows lengthened, he whispered goodnight to Z and thought of all the questions still waiting. He didn't know how fast Z would grow or what kind of world might call to it beyond their walls. But for now there was only this quiet, this shared breath. And that was enough. Z grew with a swiftness that was never rushed, as though time itself bent kindly around their companionship. By the 2nd week, small ridges began to form along its back, faint lines that caught the light like silver brushstrokes. The boy would run a finger along them, marveling at the soft texture, and Z would lean closer, humming faintly as if pleased. Every new detail became a secret folded carefully inside their days. Feeding turned into a gentle game. Z would sniff each morsel, sometimes nibbling, sometimes simply examining the boy's fingers as though tasting the care itself. They discovered that warm milk sweetened with honey coaxed Z into tiny gulps, followed by a contented sigh. Afterwards, it would curl up in the crook of the boy's arm, eyes heavy with sleep, trusting completely that the world was safe there. The boy noticed how looking after Z changed the way he moved through other moments. He listened more when people spoke, noticed details in voices and gestures he had once overlooked. Patience settled into him, slow and quiet, like rain sinking into thirsty ground. Even his grandfather commented one evening that he seemed steadier, as though the boy had found an invisible anchor. One clear morning, the old man invited him outside to fetch fresh air for the little one. They placed Z in a shallow basket lined with cloth and carried it to the back garden. Dew clung to the grass, catching early sunlight in fragile beads. Z blinked, wide-eyed, reaching a small hand toward drifting clouds. The boy watched, awed by how something so small could gaze at the sky as though it already knew the stars by heart. As days ripened into soft evenings, the boy began to speak to Z about hopes he had never shared aloud. He talked about wishing to be brave, about wanting to understand where kindness came from and how to keep it alive even when people were hurried or sharp-edged. Z would tilt its head, a silent listener, silver eyes calm and patient. In those moments, the boy felt less alone, as though his thoughts were being gently held. Sometimes at dusk, they sat by the window while the grandfather tinkered with quiet inventions behind them. The old man rarely interfered, though once he remarked, "Looking after something teaches you the shape of your own heart." The boy held those words carefully, like a lantern to be lit on darker nights. Z's movements grew steadier, its curiosity deeper. It would crawl towards scattered tools, pausing at glints of brass or the flick of a moth's wings. The boy learned to guide with a light touch, steering it away from sharp corners while still letting discovery bloom. They were learning together, two small beings on parallel paths, each shaping the other with gentleness. One evening, after Z drifted into slumber, the boy lingered beside the cradle, tracing slow circles in the air. He realized he no longer thought of the creature as strange. Z had become a quiet presence woven into the rhythm of his breath. Caring for it had settled something inside him, a hush where once there had been restless noise. He leaned close and whispered, "We'll find our way, you and I." Outside, the moon climbed a silver ladder across the dark. The boy felt its cool light spill through the window, blessing their small corner of the world. For the first time in memory, sleep came easily, carrying him into dreams where warmth and wonder waited just beyond the edge of waking. Morning found the boy in the workshop, tracing a finger through the thin mist of dust that floated in a stripe of sunlight. Z was still asleep, a small green bundle curled among folded cloth, faintly humming as though the dream it chased was sweet. The boy felt an odd sense of ceremony in the hush, as though each day began with a quiet promise, unspoken but steady. He poured himself a cup of tea from the pot his grandfather had left warming on the stove, its steam rising in lazy curls. When he turned, the old man stood in the doorway, watching with an amused softness that sat easily on his weathered face. "Looks like you're getting the hang of it," the grandfather said, stepping inside. He carried a satchel, the leather scuffed from years of use, and set it gently on the bench. From inside he drew a tangle of tools and a handful of folded papers. "Since you're already looking after one of the universe's little surprises, you might as well learn a few of its other puzzles." He spread the papers out. Diagrams of odd machines, scribbled notes about gears that seemed to wind themselves, sketches of windmills that caught not air, but whispers. The boy leaned closer, fascinated. His grandfather began explaining, not in the flat way of schoolteachers, but like someone sharing secrets meant to be savored. He spoke of balance, of how the smallest adjustment could keep a delicate structure steady. He showed how to listen for the faint click that meant a gear was settling into its rightful place. The lessons were less about invention than about patience. How to wait until the right moment revealed itself. How to trust your hands to move only after your eyes and heart had understood. Z stirred, stretching tiny limbs before blinking toward the voices. Its silver eyes caught the lamplight, turning it into a quiet sparkle. The old man chuckled, lowering his voice to a murmur. "Seems we've got an eager student," he said, nodding toward the creature. The boy carefully gathered Z, nestling it in the crook of one arm while leaning over the diagrams. Together they listened to the grandfather's stories, tales of tools that once mended themselves, of a clock that could slow the evening just enough to let people savor their supper. Some were surely inventions of imagination, but the boy loved them all the same. Later that afternoon, the grandfather led them outside. The air smelled faintly of pine and warm earth. Beyond the workshop stood an old stone table, worn smooth from years of sun and rain. On it rested a curious contraption, a small windmill connected to a series of spinning discs. "Here," the old man said, guiding the boy's hands. "Let the breeze do the work. Your task is to feel when it's moving as it should." The boy adjusted the pieces, Z perched nearby with its head tilted. Together they watched as the wind caught the blades, sending a gentle hum through the discs. It was simple, yet it felt like listening to the heartbeat of the day. As evening stretched its pale fingers across the yard, the grandfather lit a lantern. Its glow painted their faces in soft gold, and shadows swayed against the workshop wall. Z, tucked against the boy's shoulder, gave a contented sigh. The boy realized how much these slow hours meant. Lessons not only about machines or patience, but about belonging to a moment without needing to rush past it. For someone who had always felt slightly out of step with the world, this rhythm felt like home. That night, after Z was settled in its cradle, the boy sat with his grandfather by the hearth. A kettle hissed quietly over the flames. "You're learning more than you think," the old man said, stirring the fire with a careful hand. "Looking after something fragile teaches you to see, really see, the things that keep it safe." He glanced at the boy, eyes warm behind the lines of age. "Even yourself." The boy felt the words settle like smooth stones inside him, grounding and kind. When the fire burned low, they stepped out to breathe the cool night air. Above, the stars were clear and close, bright enough to brush against thought. Z slept on, untroubled by the wide sky. The boy wondered if the stars looked familiar to it, if somewhere far beyond their reach another child might be staring back. The idea was both lonely and comforting, a reminder that all living things shared some quiet thread, even across distances too vast to name. In the days that followed, the boy and Z spent more time with the grandfather's gentle puzzles. They learned how to coax a tune from a row of glass bottles, how to balance a feather on the tip of a turning wheel. Each task was less about skill than about listening to the soft shift of weight, the pause before a sound emerged, the hush that asked for attention. Z often added its own experiments, tapping claws lightly against surfaces, producing delicate rhythms that made them both laugh. On rainy afternoons they stayed indoors, the roof drumming a patient melody. The grandfather told stories then, of times he'd fixed ships whose sails caught moonlight, of once finding an entire meadow hidden inside an abandoned telescope. The boy knew some of it couldn't be true, but he didn't mind. Truth, he sensed, lived inside the way those stories made the room feel. Alive, warm, infinite. Z would press close to his chest, as though agreeing, eyes half closed, purring faintly like a lullaby. One evening, while putting away the day's tools, the boy caught his reflection in the window. For a heartbeat, he barely recognized the steadiness in his own face. Caring for Z, learning from the grandfather, it was shaping something inside him, something quiet and sure. He wasn't just reacting to the world anymore, he was meeting it, holding it carefully, piece by piece. When he finally lay down that night, the room was still except for Z's soft breathing. He thought about how small moments, stitched together, could form a kind of shelter around a person. He whispered a promise, not grand or loud, but clear. "We'll keep making space for wonder." As sleep pulled him gently under, he felt the warmth of that thought linger, like a lamp left glowing in the dark. Dawn came softly, brushing pale light across the edges of the workshop. The boy stirred awake before the sun had fully climbed, drawn by the quiet pulse of presence that Z seemed to give the room. He rose, bare feet against cool floorboards, and crossed to where the small creature still slept. Z's breathing was slow and sure, a silver gleam fluttering in its half-closed eyes as though dreams were playing behind them. The boy watched for a while, letting the peace of that simple sight seep into him. He felt as though he were watching a secret keep itself alive. By the time the kettle began its gentle sigh on the stove, Z was stirring, stretching its narrow arms in a way that made the boy smile. He lifted the little one carefully, feeling the warmth of its body against his chest, and carried it toward the window. Outside, morning fog curled across the yard, softening the corners of the world. Together they stood, silent witnesses to a day beginning. Later, the grandfather wandered in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and looked at Z with a knowing tilt of his head. "You're both ready to see a bit more of what's out there," he murmured, reaching for a well-worn satchel by the door. He suggested a walk through the meadow beyond the old fence, a place where wildflowers tangled with forgotten paths. The boy hesitated only a moment before nodding, excitement and steadiness weaving together in his chest. They stepped outside, the air still cool, dew clinging to the grass. Z nestled in the crook of the boy's elbow, blinking wide at the brightness. Birds sang from hidden perches, and a slow breeze combed the tops of the grasses. Every few steps, Z would reach toward a drifting seed or turn its head to follow the flicker of a butterfly. Its curiosity was quiet, thoughtful, as if the world were a story it was learning to read one line at a time. When they reached the meadow, the grandfather paused to let them look. Sunlight spilled across the clearing, painting gold on every blade and petal. The boy knelt, letting Z crawl onto the soft earth, its small claws pressed into the soil with delicate certainty. It tilted its head, eyes reflecting the pale sky, and let out a sound halfway between a sigh and a question. The boy answered by simply sitting near, his palms open on the grass, offering closeness instead of explanations. They spent much of the morning exploring small wonders, a cluster of violet flowers cupped like tiny bells, the silver tracks of a snail glistening on a stone, a breeze that bent the taller stalks into slow dances. Z tested each new discovery, sometimes tapping it gently, sometimes pressing its face close to listen. The boy began to notice how often stillness was part of learning, how waiting could reveal more than rushing ever did. At midday, they sat beneath an old oak whose roots curled like resting animals. The grandfather unpacked a modest lunch, handing the boys slices of bread and fruit. Z sniffed at the offerings, nibbling a crumb with great seriousness before retreating to the boy's lap. They shared their food quietly, companionable in a way that required no words. Above them, sunlight trickled through leaves, dappling skin and scales alike. As the afternoon wore on, clouds gathered into soft mounds overhead, shading the meadow in gentle grey. The boy lay back, resting his head on folded arms. Z crawled up to perch on his chest, blinking slowly, its body light and warm. He felt its heartbeat under his palm, steady and small, and marveled at how something so slight could already fill so much space inside him. He realized that caring wasn't just about protecting, it was also about letting wonder live between two beings, unhurried. The grandfather's voice floated across the quiet. He was telling a story about a tree that had once grown silver fruit, so bright it looked like moonlight ripened on branches. He said travelers would come from far away just to sit beneath it, not to take anything, only to look and breathe. The boy felt the meaning beneath the tale, that some treasures are kept alive not by ownership, but by presence. He glanced at Z and understood why the story had been shared. As shadows lengthened, they made their way back toward the workshop. The boy carried Z, whose eyes drooped contentedly, tail trailing like a ribbon over his arm. A peace settled on him, different from the start of the day. Deeper, anchored, the path home seemed lined with small lanterns of memory. The dew on the grass, the soft hum of the windmill in the yard, the sound of Z's quiet breath as it rested close. Back inside, evening lights glowed amber against the walls. The boy laid Z in its nest, adjusting the cloth until the little one sighed and curled tighter. He sat nearby for a long while, feeling the day stretch softly behind him like an unbroken thread. He thought about how, only weeks ago, he had felt adrift, unsure of his place among people and things. Now the simple act of tending, of showing up, of watching carefully, was shaping a new steadiness inside him. When the last lamp was dimmed, moonlight reached through the window, pooling on the floor. The boy leaned over the cradle, brushing a fingertip across Z's smooth head. "Sleep well," he whispered, not just to the creature, but to the part of himself that had begun to believe in belonging. The room answered with its familiar hush, and in that quiet, the boy felt an assurance, settled deep and sure. Whatever lay ahead, they were already learning how to walk toward it together. The year stretched itself open like a quiet meadow, and, in its stillness, Morty found room to breathe a little deeper than before. The Gazorpian child, once so small in his trembling arms, had begun to toddle across the living room floor, clutching at the soft edges of rugs and the legs of chairs, as though the whole house were a landscape designed for his discovery. Morty would sit cross-legged nearby, letting the boy's laughter ripple through him like light across water. There was a fragile perfection in those mornings, the smell of cereal in the air, the sleepy haze of cartoons on mute, the boy's dark eyes brimming with a language that didn't need words. Sometimes Morty remembered the awkwardness of those first nights, when he had been too frightened to sleep, convinced he would miss some crucial cry or gesture. Now he had learned to rest with one ear open, trusting the rhythm of the child's breathing. They had settled into a wordless pact. Morty offered warmth and watchfulness, and in return the little one gifted him a sense of purpose, as quiet as moonlight. He didn't announce himself as a hero, didn't imagine trophies or applause. The victory was in holding steady when the world outside felt too quick and too sharp. On soft afternoons, he'd carry the boy outside to sit beneath the tree at the edge of the yard. The trunk was scarred with initials carved by strangers long ago, and Morty sometimes traced them with his thumb, thinking of all the people who had once paused there. The branches swayed above, dropping shadows across their faces. He'd hum simple tunes, not quite songs, but gentle patterns of sound that made the boy tilt his head and smile. Even Rick, drifting in and out with gadgets and scattered advice, seemed to slow down whenever he stepped into that shaded corner, as though the hush had managed to touch him too. Morty's friends occasionally asked if he felt trapped, if parenthood, even the accidental, intergalactic kind, wasn't too heavy for someone his age. He'd shrug, not out of dismissal, but because the answer wasn't simple. There were moments of wait, yes, nights when exhaustion folded over him like a heavy blanket. But there were also mornings when the child's hand rested on his cheek and a quiet understanding passed between them, bright enough to erase every question. He was learning that love, the unadorned kind, carried its own lightness, even when the work was steady and unglamorous. One evening, as dusk pressed soft lavender against the windows, Morty felt an unexpected tug of memory. He saw himself as a younger boy, clinging nervously to Rick's coat as they stepped into wild adventures. Back then, he had looked to his grandfather for answers, for a map through strange galaxies and stranger fears. Now, without quite realizing it, he had become a small map for someone else, a beacon made of simple gestures, the steady hand, the listening ear, the willingness to stay. The thought settled over him with a quiet kind of pride, loud or showy, but tender and sure. He began to notice how the child mirrored him, the way they both tilted their heads when curious, or how their eyes softened in the same way when listening. At bedtime, Morty would lie on the floor beside the crib, telling small, shapeless stories about stars that liked to nap or rivers that sang lullabies to passing fish. The boy rarely understood the words, but he seemed to absorb the calm, settling deeper into his blanket. Morty often stayed until sleep wrapped them both, his hand resting lightly on the rail, the world outside fading into a distant hush. There was one night, however, when a storm wandered across the neighborhood, carrying a low growl of thunder. The boy woke with a startled cry, and Morty instinctively gathered him close. They sat together near the window, watching silver rain thread itself across the glass. Morty whispered soft nonsense, rocking gently until the sobs quieted. In that fragile stillness, he felt something ancient pass through him, a quiet knowing that all living things sought the same shelter, the same steady arms when the sky grew loud. He pressed a kiss to the child's forehead, grateful for the trust placed in his inexperienced hands. Rick found them there later, the lab coat faintly damp from his own trip through the rain. For a rare moment, his eyes softened, and he simply nodded before retreating to whatever quiet project had called him home. Morty watched him go, sensing layers of affection beneath the gruffness. Perhaps he thought everyone carried storms inside, and maybe the way forward was just to sit with one another until they passed. As the week stretched on, Morty and the boy learned the language of small rituals, the clink of spoons at breakfast, the slow march of bath time, the nightly parade of stuffed animals arranged with solemn precision. These were not grand adventures, but they were steady, golden threads weaving a life. Each act, however minor, was a promise repeated. I'm here, I'll keep showing up, we belong. When the child finally drifted off one quiet night, Morty remained. Beside him a little longer, watching the soft rise and fall of tiny shoulders beneath the blanket. Outside, the moon floated pale and unhurried, and a breeze carried the scent of wet grass through the open window. Morty thought about how far they'd both come since that chaotic day in the marketplace of a distant world. There would be challenges ahead, tantrums, questions, maybe even farewells. But for now there was only this calm, this silent agreement that for tonight at least they had enough. He lay back, letting the quiet cradle him too. The walls of the room seemed to breathe with them, steady and kind. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked softly, marking time not as a threat, but as a gentle companion. Morty closed his eyes, the boy's warmth close enough to feel, and allowed himself to imagine that the universe, vast and unruly though it was, might also be leaning in to watch over them. Morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting stripes of gold across the floor. The boy stirred first, small hands stretching in slow arcs as though trying to catch the light itself. Morty watched from the doorway, smiling quietly, his own movements careful so as not to break the delicate rhythm of waking. There was a familiarity now to these moments, a gentle choreography of breath, warmth, and quiet observation. The child's first giggles of the day rose like small bells in the room, soft and unhurried, and Morty felt the tug of a steady, unspoken joy settle in his chest. By breakfast, the routine had woven itself into something almost ritual. Morty arranged small plates of fruit and cereal while the child babbled happily, pointing at the window, at his shoes, at the pattern of sunlight spilling across the table. The words didn't matter, the meaning was clear. Everything was discovery, and every reaction was its own quiet conversation. Morty learned to interpret every tilt of the head, every blink and sigh, reading them as one might read a page of an unfinished story. Later they ventured outside, the boy toddling alongside Morty on unsteady legs. The wind was playful, brushing past and teasing strands of hair, and the air carried the faint scent of wet earth. Small things seemed suddenly monumental, a cluster of ants navigating a leaf, the shimmer of a beetle's back in the sun, the slow sway of a dandelion ready to scatter its seeds. Morty knelt often to point, to guide, or simply to watch, marveling at the way attention could deepen when it was given in full, uninterrupted presence. As they wandered toward the edge of the yard, Morty noticed the child pausing to crouch by a small puddle, fascinated by the reflection of clouds. He squatted beside him, letting the boy's hands skim the water's surface. Ripples formed and dissolved, and Morty found himself smiling at the universality of wonder, how it belonged to anyone who slowed down enough to see. The child looked up at him then, eyes shining with the unspoken question of delight, and Morty felt his own heart reflect the same awe. Afternoons brought quiet lessons. Morty guided the boy through small tasks, turning ordinary chores into games of focus and patience. Folding laundry became an exploration of textures, watering the small patch of garden outside a chance to study the colors of life. They shared these moments in silence as often as in speech, communicating in gestures, glances, and the soft hum of contentment that seemed to bind them together. Every success, no matter how small, was celebrated with laughter, and every minor stumble was met with calm reassurance. Evenings carried the ritual of storytelling. Morty would sit cross-legged on the floor beside the boy's bed, weaving tales of gentle imagination, clouds that slept across mountains, rivers that whispered secrets to stones, stars that traveled quietly across the sky while humans slept. The child rarely followed the words exactly, but he absorbed the rhythm, the care, and the warmth behind them. Morty sometimes paused to watch, letting the soft rise and fall of the child's breathing guide his own thoughts toward stillness and reflection. One particularly quiet evening, as the moon began to trace silver paths across the room, Morty realized something remarkable. The child's laughter, once hesitant and uncertain, now carried confidence and curiosity. The boy reached for small objects on his own, explored corners with gentle determination, and even attempted to speak words that Morty did not always understand, but which carried meaning in their tone and persistence. There was a trust growing between them, a sense of belonging that transcended language or age. Morty felt both humbled and proud, aware that these small, unnoticed moments were quietly forming the foundation of a lifelong connection. The grandfather visited occasionally, carrying his usual air of quiet mischief tempered by unexpected wisdom. He would offer a story, a small mechanical puzzle, or a question designed to stretch imagination without pressure. Morty watched him with gratitude, understanding that these interludes were not just diversions, but gentle reminders that patience and care had echoes far beyond the immediate moment. Z, the little Gazorpian boy, responded to these visits with curiosity and shy observation, adding small touches of mischief that made everyone laugh and softened the edges of the day. Night times, though remained the most intimate and sacred, Morty often lingered after tucking the boy in, sitting by the crib with a soft hum or a whispered word of reassurance. The moonlight pooled across the floor, touching the small creature in silvery warmth. Morty found himself reflecting on the strange, unexpected journey that had brought him here. From fear, uncertainty, and self-doubt to a patient, grounded presence. He realized that parenthood, in this quiet and unusual form, had taught him lessons he might never have learned in any other way, about attention, humility, and the steady power of love expressed without fanfare. One night, a sudden gust rattled the window pane, and the child stirred, eyes blinking into the shadows. Morty leaned close, whispering soothing nonsense and brushing a soft hand across his forehead. In the pause that followed, he felt the soft reassurance of trust and safety passing between them, delicate yet unbreakable. Outside, stars blinked silently, and Morty understood that these small acts of care, repeated, consistent, and filled with presence, were shaping a legacy more lasting than any grand adventure. By the end of the week, Morty noticed subtle changes. The child's exploration was more confident, his gestures more intentional, his eyes reflecting an inner understanding of the world and the love surrounding him. Morty felt a swell of gratitude for the patience required, for the quiet constancy of shared presence. He knew that they were building something enduring, a life made rich not by dramatic feats, but by everyday acts of care and attention. That night, Morty remained by the crib longer than usual, letting the world outside settle into silence. He whispered a soft promise to be present, to watch, to guide, and to learn alongside the boy as they both grew. The moonlight spilled over the two of them, a pale halo of calm, and he closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the day melt into gentle peace. In the hush, he understood fully that life's quiet victories were sometimes the most profound, and that love, patient and steady, could transform everything it touched. The morning began quietly, with the faint hum of the city beyond the walls blending with the soft rhythm of the household. Morty stirred first, glancing toward the crib, where the boy lay nestled beneath a pale blanket. The child's chest rose and fell steadily, and the silver light of early dawn touched the fine curves of his face. Morty lingered a moment, savoring the hush, the way the room seemed to exhale alongside him. In this small, shared stillness, he felt the familiar grounding of purpose, the delicate assurance that someone needed him in ways both profound and tender. After a breakfast of soft bread and warm fruit, Morty led the boy to the workshop, carrying him carefully while letting him wave at shadows and sunlight. Z, small and bright-eyed, reached toward tools and ribbons scattered across the table, curiosity guiding every movement. Morty followed, attentive, allowing each exploration to unfold at the child's pace. He noticed how the boy's fingers lingered on smooth surfaces, how his gaze lingered on small details, the glint of brass, the shimmer of a tiny gear, the quiet rotation of a miniature windmill. Each observation was a lesson in patience, teaching Morty anew how to slow his own thoughts to match the rhythm of someone learning. Afternoons often took them to the yard. The wind played softly across tall grass, bending it into slow arcs. The boy toddled carefully, reaching out for dandelions and blades of grass, and Morty followed, ready to catch or steady but rarely intervening unless truly necessary. There was a balance to these moments, an understanding that the world was a place to explore safely, yet without the overbearing presence of control. Morty realized that letting go in measured ways was just as much an act of love as holding close. One afternoon, the boy discovered a shallow puddle left from a recent rain. He squatted, splashing lightly with small hands, and Morty watched the ripples spread across the surface. There was delight in those tiny waves, a simple joy that seemed to make the sunlight itself shimmer more brightly. Morty knelt beside him, letting his own fingers trace patterns in the water, and for a while they moved together, two small forces shaping and responding to one another's rhythm. The child's laughter, soft and unrestrained, made the air feel warmer, richer, and Morty found himself smiling more freely than he had in months. The grandfather stopped by that afternoon, carrying an assortment of small objects, tiny clocks, a few glass jars, a string of beads. He set them on the workbench and watched as Morty and the boy explored. "Curiosity is a quiet teacher," he said, his voice low and soft. "It teaches patience, observation, and a careful hand. And sometimes it teaches joy." Morty nodded, realizing that these small lessons were weaving themselves into every corner of his life. The child absorbed them too, pressing beads together, tilting jars in the sunlight, and occasionally looking up with wide eyes that reflected wonder and trust alike. Evenings became their most sacred ritual. Morty would guide the boy through the slow winding down of the day, a warm bath, soft pajamas, and a careful tucking in. He whispered gentle stories of stars and rivers, of clouds that wandered slowly across distant landscapes, of leaves that carried secrets from one tree to another. The words themselves were not important. It was the rhythm, the attention, the care behind them. The child listened with half-closed eyes, absorbing more than words could carry. Morty stayed until the soft rise and fall of breathing marked the child's drift into sleep, his own heartbeat slowing to match the cadence. One night, as a breeze stirred the curtains, the boy woke, startled by a distant clap of thunder. Morty moved immediately, gathering him into his arms, murmuring nonsense words and gentle reassurances. The child clung lightly, small hands gripping the fabric of Morty's shirt, and the storm outside became a distant rhythm rather than a threat. Morty realized that these moments, the sudden disruptions, the quiet responses, were forming the most enduring lessons of all: trust, patience, and presence. The world could rumble and shake, but love created a steady center that held firm through tremors both small and large. The weeks passed in this way, gentle and deliberate. Morty noticed subtle changes in the boy, steadier steps, longer attention spans, and the beginnings of words spoken with intent. Each achievement, each small milestone, became a quiet celebration. Morty felt the weight of responsibility, yes, but also the profound satisfaction of watching growth unfold, as if life itself were bending kindly to allow them these small, perfect revelations. During one late afternoon, they discovered a new rhythm together. Quiet play beneath the tree in the yard. The boy explored, Morty guided, and the sunlight drifted across them in soft, shifting patterns. The grandfather joined briefly, sharing a story about a river that could carry whispers to distant mountains, emphasizing the gentle patience required to listen closely. The boy tilted his head and giggled. Morty chuckled softly, and for a few minutes all three of them existed in a kind of suspended calm, wrapped in the warmth of quiet companionship. When night settled in fully, Morty lingered beside the crib longer than usual, feeling the soft, steady warmth of the child's body and the rhythm of trust that had grown between them. He whispered promises, not grand declarations, but small assurances of care and constancy. Outside, the moonlight spread its gentle glow, touching the edges of the room and illuminating the stillness. Morty closed his eyes briefly, letting the quiet sink in. In this soft interlude, he understood fully that love was often a series of gentle, repeated acts, cumulative in their power, forming a foundation that nothing could easily shake. Finally, he leaned back against the wall, watching the moon trace silver paths across the floor. The boy slept peacefully, and the room seemed to sigh along with them. Morty felt the faint hum of contentment, a delicate reassurance that life, in its quiet persistence, held space for care, wonder, and trust. In the hush of the night, he realized that these simple days, filled with small attentions and steady presence, were shaping something far deeper than any grand adventure could. The steady, luminous heartbeat of connection, unbroken and enduring. The day began in a soft hush, the kind of morning where even the birds seemed to move with careful deliberation. Morty stirred first, lifting the blanket to find the child already awake, small hands reaching toward the slanting light that painted the room in pale gold. He settled beside the crib, letting the boy's fingers brush his own, feeling the warmth and trust that had grown so naturally between them. It was a quiet moment, unremarkable to anyone else, but to Morty, it held the weight of countless small victories. A bond formed, steady and unspoken, built on patience, attention, and love. Breakfast followed the usual rhythm, soft bread and sliced fruit, the boy's laughter ringing out like tiny bells. Morty watched each gesture carefully, how the child pointed, how he leaned, how his eyes lit up at even the simplest discovery. Every movement was a question, every blink a hint of understanding forming. Morty found joy in these quiet patterns, in the way learning and care intertwined seamlessly. Life, in these moments, felt like a gentle tide, constant and comforting, carrying them forward without urgency. Later, they ventured into the garden. The sun had begun its slow climb, turning the dew into tiny points of reflected light that made the blades of grass sparkle as if they were stitched with diamonds. The boy toddled carefully, sometimes tripping, sometimes pausing, to examine a small stone or the curve of a leaf. Morty followed closely, letting him explore while keeping a steady presence, ready to catch or guide, but rarely interfering. He found a calm beauty in this measured freedom, understanding that growth required both support and space to stumble. At the edge of the yard, a small patch of wildflowers had begun to bloom, bright against the gentle green. The boy crouched, fascinated by the colors and textures, reaching out with small hands to brush petals lightly. Morty knelt beside him, tracing the outlines of leaves and flowers, explaining softly, not with expectation, but with wonder. Each word was less a lesson than an offering, an invitation to observe, to notice, to appreciate. The boy responded with soft sounds, pointing and gesturing, and Morty realized that these exchanges, wordless and patient, were shaping understanding in ways no hurried instruction ever could. In the afternoon, the grandfather visited, carrying his familiar assortment of curiosities, a handful of shiny marbles, a bundle of feathers, and a small music box that played a tune both melancholy and sweet. He set them on the workbench, smiling at the child, who reached out with cautious excitement. "Curiosity," the grandfather said softly, "is the quietest teacher, yet it leaves the deepest marks." Morty nodded, realizing how much these visits strengthened the rhythm of their days, an echo of wisdom shared gently, without pressure, only presence. The child responded eagerly, touching and exploring, discovering patterns, and feeling the world through the small, deliberate acts that Morty had learned to honor. Evening brought the calm that Morty had grown to cherish. Bath time, soft pajamas, and careful tucking in were acts of intimacy, each performed with thought and care. Morty whispered stories of drifting clouds, rivers that sang to stones, and stars that traveled slowly across the sky. The child listened, absorbed not just the words, but the tone, the rhythm, the warmth behind them. Morty often lingered after sleep had claimed the boy, resting his hand lightly on the small chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of breathing, a soft reassurance that presence itself could shape safety and trust. One night, a storm passed overhead, the distant rumble of thunder mingling with the hum of rain against the roof. The boy stirred, startled by the sound, and Morty gathered him close. He whispered nonsense and soothing words, moving in quiet circles near the window, letting the storm pass like a story unfolding. The child's small fingers curled into his shirt, eyes wide but trusting, and Morty felt the profound significance of these moments, that care, steady and gentle, could weather any external turbulence. He pressed a kiss to the boy's temple, grateful for the trust placed in his hands. The weeks unfolded like soft petals, each day offering small lessons in presence, patience, and shared wonder. Morty noticed the child's growing independence, longer attention spans, more intentional gestures, tentative words forming with courage. Each new accomplishment was celebrated quietly, with smiles, laughter, and soft approval, reinforcing the subtle rhythm of learning and connection that had come to define their lives. Morty himself had changed, grown more patient, more attentive, more aware of the small. cumulative power of consistent care. Late one afternoon, they found themselves beneath the old oak at the edge of the yard. Sunlight filtered through branches, dappling the ground in shifting patterns. The grandfather joined them briefly, telling a story about a river that whispered secrets to the mountains it passed. The boy giggled at the imagined scene, and Morty felt a swelling gratitude for the simplicity of shared presence. In that quiet corner, with light, shadow, and small voices mingling, Morty understood that these unremarkable moments were the foundation of something lasting, a bond unshaken by time, composed of trust, attentiveness, and love. Night fell, bringing the hush of settled space. Morty lingered beside the crib longer than usual, brushing a finger along the child's hair, feeling the warmth and weight of shared trust. The moonlight spilled across the floor, touching both of them in gentle silver, as if the world itself had paused to observe. Morty whispered promises, not grand declarations, but assurances of presence, consistency, and care. In this quiet intimacy, he recognized a profound truth. Love often exists in repeated, deliberate acts, small and unassuming, yet forming a foundation that nothing could undo. As the storm faded and the night deepened, Morty settled beside the crib, letting the rhythmic rise and fall of the child's breathing lull him into his own reflection. The days had been simple, filled with minor challenges, tiny victories, and consistent acts of care, yet they had formed something extraordinary, a life threaded with trust, understanding, and quiet wonder. Morty allowed himself to rest, cradled in the knowledge that the most profound journeys often unfolded not in chaos or spectacle, but in the steady, patient cultivation of connection and love. The morning arrived with a soft, golden haze, as if the world itself were taking a deep, slow breath. Morty moved quietly through the room, careful not to disturb the peaceful rhythm of the household. The boy lay nestled beneath his blanket, small hands curling lightly around the edge of the quilt, eyes fluttering open to meet the new day. Morty knelt beside him, letting a finger trace a gentle line across his cheek. There was an understanding between them now, subtle but profound, a language formed of presence, touch, and steady attention. The child's trust was luminous, and Morty felt it like sunlight pooling across his chest. Breakfast was calm and unhurried. Soft bread, warm fruit, and gentle conversation filled the room. The boy babbled happily, pointing at his spoon, at the sunlight across the table, at the small flicker of dust dancing in the air. Morty watched, listening as much as he spoke, letting the boy's curiosity guide the flow of their morning. In this quiet attentiveness, he realized that these simple acts were more significant than any grand adventure, that showing up, repeatedly and patiently, was the truest form of heroism. Later, they wandered into the yard, where the air carried the scent of early flowers and fresh grass. The boy toddled carefully across the soft earth, exploring with tentative delight. Morty followed, steadying him only when needed, but mostly allowing the child to navigate, to stumble, to discover. Each small step was a lesson, each pause a moment of reflection. Morty marveled at how quickly the boy was learning, how the world itself seemed to unfold differently through his eyes, vibrant, curious, full of quiet wonders waiting to be noticed. They paused beneath the familiar oak at the edge of the yard. Its trunk, scarred by years of passing hands, felt like an old friend. Morty sat on the ground, letting the boy explore the roots, touch the bark, and reach toward the sky above. The light filtered through the leaves, shifting with the gentle afternoon breeze. Morty observed how the child's focus and confidence had grown, gestures precise, attention prolonged, curiosity tempered by careful observation. There was a subtle elegance in these small milestones, a rhythm in which growth was measured not by spectacle, but by consistent engagement with the world and the people in it. The grandfather arrived briefly, carrying his usual assortment of trinkets and small curiosities. He set them on the ground, smooth stones, a few colorful feathers, and a tiny wooden toy. The child reached for them eagerly, his small hands exploring texture and shape. "These," the grandfather said softly, "are not just objects. They are teachers, gentle and quiet. They teach patience, attention, and delight in the little things." Morty watched, noting how these quiet interventions strengthened the fabric of daily life, reinforcing lessons that needed no grand gestures to be profound. As afternoon faded into evening, Morty prepared a simple dinner. The boy perched nearby in his small chair, reaching and gesturing, a constant presence of inquiry and wonder. Morty moved through the motions with practiced ease, noting how their days had settled into a calm, deliberate rhythm. There were challenges, certainly, moments of frustration, of uncertainty, of tears both large and small, but each was met with patience, each dissolved gently into understanding. Morty recognized that these patterns, repeated day after day, were shaping a life not through dramatic acts, but through quiet, enduring care. Night arrived with its familiar hush. Morty guided the boy through bath time, soft pajamas, and the gentle tucking-in ritual that had become sacred. He whispered small stories, rivers that carried whispers to mountains, clouds that napped slowly across the sky, stars that traveled silently in constellations of calm. The boy listened, absorbing not just the words but the warmth and rhythm behind them, learning through presence rather than instruction. Morty remained until the small rise and fall of the child's breathing marked sleep, allowing the quiet to sink deep into his own awareness. That night, a breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the faint scent of flowers and rain. The child stirred briefly, a soft whimper escaping before Morty gathered him close. They sat together, Morty humming gentle, improvised tunes, until the boy's fingers relaxed and his breathing steadied. Morty felt the profound significance of these small, repeated moments, that trust, patience, and steadfast care could create a sanctuary against the vast and unpredictable world. Love, he realized, existed most profoundly in these repeated, deliberate acts, small and unassuming, yet cumulative in their power. As the night deepened, Morty remained by the crib, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. From the uncertainty and fear of early days to the confident, tender rhythm they now shared, every step had been built on quiet attention, steady presence, and unwavering patience. Morty understood that life's most enduring lessons were not found in spectacle, in conquest, or in grandeur, but in the everyday acts of care that shaped connection, nurtured trust, and built resilience. He pressed a soft kiss to the child's forehead and whispered a promise to continue showing up, to remain steady, to learn alongside him, and to honor the quiet beauty of each day. Outside, the moonlight stretched across the floor, pale and unhurried, as if the universe itself were offering its gentle witness. Morty closed his eyes, letting the calm settle over him, feeling the shared heartbeat of trust and love that pulsed between them. In those final hours before sleep, claimed both of them fully, Morty allowed himself to reflect on the lessons learned, that small gestures could hold profound weight, that patience nurtured growth, that love revealed itself in consistency and presence rather than dramatic displays. The child stirred slightly, safe and warm, and Morty smiled, feeling the soft glow of quiet contentment fill the room. Everything had become simpler, more luminous, more meaningful, through the accumulation of these small, intentional acts. Finally, he settled back against the wall, letting the hush of the night cradle them both. Outside, the stars traced slow, deliberate paths across the sky. Morty thought of the journey ahead, the many days still to come, and felt a profound reassurance that whatever challenges awaited, the foundation they had built, steady, patient, and full of care, would hold firm. He whispered a final word of promise and gratitude, feeling the bond between them hum with quiet strength, and somewhere, in that soft, suspended moment, Morty understood that their story was not one of endings or dramatic resolutions. It was a story of presence, of attention, of love that grew quietly and steadily, shaping a life rich in meaning and connection. And with that, he leaned back, letting the night enfold them both. The moonlight painting silver paths across the floor, the boy breathing softly beside him, and the world outside offering its calm, unbroken witness. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. The morning arrived soft and unhurried, sunlight filtering through the blinds in gentle streaks. Morty rose quietly, careful not to disturb the boy, who was already awake and reaching for the edges of his blanket. There was a small stretch, a yawn, and a subtle glance that said more than words ever could. Morty knelt beside him, letting a finger brush across his small hand. In that simple touch was a world of trust and familiarity, a language built over months of careful presence. The boy's eyes shone with curiosity, reflecting the quiet rhythm of life that had settled between them. Breakfast was gentle and deliberate, the kind of meal where the pace itself became a lesson. Morty placed soft bread and warm fruit in front of the boy, and they shared small glances, subtle gestures, and occasional soft laughter. The boy pointed at the sunlight spilling across the table, at the shadow of a spoon, and Morty responded with quiet commentary, turning ordinary observation into a shared experience. Every motion, every small interaction, felt like a thread weaving their lives closer together, binding them with patience, care, and subtle delight. Later they wandered into the yard, where the morning air was fresh with dew and the soft scent of grass. The boy toddled carefully, sometimes falling and sometimes pausing to examine a leaf or a pebble. Morty followed closely, offering guidance only when needed, allowing the child to explore the world at his own pace. Each stumble was met with calm reassurance, each discovery with quiet celebration. Morty realized that growth came not through instruction or pressure, but through steady support and the freedom to experience the world with curiosity and care. Beneath the old oak at the edge of the yard, they paused to watch sunlight shift through the branches. The boy crouched, reaching out to touch roots and leaves, his small fingers exploring textures with gentle intent. Morty knelt beside him, tracing the lines of bark and leaves with his own hands, whispering observations without expectation. There was a rhythm here, a soft, deliberate cadence that allowed both of them to notice, to feel, and to learn. Morty understood that these ordinary moments were quietly extraordinary, each one forming a foundation of trust, patience, and shared wonder. The grandfather arrived, carrying a small bundle wrapped in soft cloth. Inside were a few smooth stones, a delicate wind chime, and a tiny glass figurine that captured light like a shard of sunlight. He laid them carefully on the workbench, letting the boy reach out with awe and curiosity. "Every small thing," he said softly, "has a story to tell if you pay attention. And sometimes the quietest stories are the most important." Morty watched, noting how these subtle interventions reinforced the lessons of presence, observation, and gentle care. The child's delight was immediate, his small hands exploring shapes, colors, and textures, forming a vocabulary of wonder that needed no words. Afternoons were often devoted to quiet exploration and play. Morty set up small games, matching patterns, arranging objects by color or size, and gently guiding the boy through tasks that required patience and focus. Each activity was an opportunity for learning, but also for connection. Morty observed how the child's attention had lengthened, how small gestures were becoming deliberate, how curiosity was shaping confidence. It was a slow, steady unfolding, like petals opening in sunlight, and Morty felt a profound sense of gratitude for the trust and companionship that had grown between them. Evening descended softly, bringing the familiar rituals that anchored their days. Bath time, soft pajamas, and careful tucking in were not mere routines but acts of intimacy and reassurance. Morty whispered stories, clouds that wandered slowly across the sky, rivers that whispered secrets to stones, stars that traveled silently in constellations of calm. The child absorbed not just the words, but the tone, the rhythm, the care behind them. Morty often lingered after the boy had drifted to sleep, hand resting lightly on the small chest, listening to the steady rise and fall of breathing, and feeling a quiet exhale of shared trust and peace. One night, as the wind rustled through the open window, a distant clap of thunder stirred the child briefly. Morty gathered him close, murmuring nonsense words and soft reassurance until his small fingers relaxed, clinging lightly but comfortably. The storm outside was nothing more than a distant rhythm, and in the stillness that followed, Morty reflected on the significance of these quiet, repeated acts that trust, patience, and gentle attention could create a sanctuary in any circumstance, a place of safety and belonging. Weeks passed, and with them came subtle changes. The boy's steps were steadier, his gestures intentional, his curiosity balanced by careful observation. Morty celebrated each milestone quietly, a longer focus on a task, a word spoken with intent, a new movement explored. He recognized that these small, ordinary moments were cumulatively extraordinary, forming a foundation stronger than any dramatic display could achieve. The rhythm of daily life had settled into a steady pulse of care, attention, and shared joy. During one quiet afternoon beneath the oak, Morty watched the boy experiment with a small set of objects, arranging them with concentration and care. The grandfather observed from nearby, nodding softly, offering a gentle reminder of patience, of the quiet ways learning and growth occur. The child giggled, Morty chuckled, and for a few minutes all three shared a stillness that was both tender and profound. It was in these understated moments that the essence of connection revealed itself, not through spectacle, but through consistency, attentiveness, and trust. Nightfall eventually arrived, wrapping the room in gentle shadows. Morty lingered beside the crib, feeling the warmth and presence of the child. He whispered promises of continued care, steady attention, and unwavering support. The moonlight spilled across the floor in pale streams, touching both of them softly, as if the world itself were offering quiet witness. Morty closed his eyes briefly, letting the calm settle over him, grateful for the journey they had shared and the bond that had grown unshakable in its simplicity. In the hush of the night, he reflected on the truth he had learned, that love was most profound not in grand gestures, but in repeated, deliberate acts of care. That presence, attentiveness, and patience formed the most enduring foundation for growth and trust, and that the quiet, steady rhythm of life held a beauty unmatched by any chaos or spectacle. The child's soft breathing became a lullaby of reassurance, a reminder that they had built something lasting, luminous and full of trust. And, finally, as the night deepened, Morty leaned back, letting the hush of the room enfold them both. The stars traced slow, unhurried paths across the sky, and the rhythm of life, quiet and steady, pulsed softly around them. He whispered a final word of promise and gratitude, knowing that the most profound stories are told not in endings or triumphs, but in small, repeated acts of love, care, and attention. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man. The day began with a soft, amber light spilling through the window, gentle enough to rouse the boy without startling him. Morty watched as he stretched small arms toward the sunlight, a quiet ritual that had become both ordinary and extraordinary in its repetition. He knelt beside the crib, brushing a loose strand of hair from the boy's forehead. In that simple act was the accumulation of countless small attentions, each one a testament to trust, patience, and the slow unfolding of care. The child's gaze met his, bright and curious, and Morty felt the familiar warmth of connection that had grown steady over many months. Breakfast unfolded in calm rhythm. Soft bread, warm fruit, and a bit of honey created a familiar routine. The boy pointed at sunlight glinting on the table, at a small crack in the floor, and at the movement of dust motes in the air. Morty responded in kind, turning observation into shared wonder, letting his own delight mirror the child's curiosity. Each day, these small exchanges became more meaningful, a quiet dialogue of presence and attention. The world felt expansive yet tender, shaped as much by observation and care as by movement or words. After breakfast, they ventured into the yard, where the early morning breeze carried the faint scent of flowers and wet grass. The boy toddled carefully, exploring the soft earth with small, deliberate steps. Morty followed closely, hands ready to catch or guide, but mostly allowing him the freedom to explore. Each stumble was met with gentle encouragement, each success with quiet praise. Morty recognized that growth required space as much as support, and that the most meaningful lessons were often those discovered through patience, observation, and the small, repeated trials of exploration. Beneath the familiar oak, they paused to examine the sunlight shifting through the leaves. The boy crouched beside a small root, tracing its curves with tiny fingers, while Morty mirrored the motion, tracing the lines of bark and moss. There was no rush, no expectation, only the steady rhythm of presence. Morty found himself marveling at how the child's confidence had grown. Deliberate gestures, longer attention spans, and a budding sense of understanding about the world around him. Each small accomplishment felt monumental, a quiet marker of trust, patience, and the power of consistent care. The grandfather arrived in the afternoon, carrying a small wooden box. Inside were a few polished stones, a delicate bell, and a tiny carved figurine. He set them gently on the workbench, smiling at the child who reached eagerly, eyes wide with wonder. "Every small thing," he said softly, "carries a story if you only notice. And sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that teach us the most." Morty observed how these brief visits enriched their days, reinforcing lessons of observation, patience, and attentiveness. The child engaged eagerly, exploring the objects with care, discovering textures and patterns that illuminated a subtle world of learning. Afternoons were devoted to quiet games, gentle lessons, and exploration. Morty arranged objects by shape, color, or size, letting the boy interact and discover. Sometimes they worked side by side. Other times, the child explored independently, confident in his ability to examine, manipulate, and understand. Morty marveled at how curiosity had transformed into concentration, how mistakes were met with resilience, and how patience had become a quiet bridge between adult and child. These small, deliberate acts were shaping both of them, forming rhythms that were as essential as sunlight and air. Evening descended softly, bringing the familiar rituals of winding down. Bath time, soft pajamas, and gentle tucking in had become sacred, intimate moments. Morty whispered stories of clouds drifting lazily across the sky, rivers murmuring to stones, and stars moving quietly across constellations of calm. The boy absorbed not only the words, but the care, the tone, the steady attention behind them. Morty often lingered afterward, resting a hand lightly on the small chest, feeling the rise and fall of breath, the soft exhale of trust and peace that filled the room. That night, a distant rumble of thunder stirred the boy briefly. Morty gathered him close, whispering nonsense words and gentle reassurances. The storm became a rhythm rather than a threat, a reminder that the world could tremble, but within the safe, steady presence of love, all tremors could be met with calm. The child's small hands curled lightly around his shirt, eyes wide but trusting. And Morty reflected on the significance of these nightly rituals, that love, patience, and consistency could shape a life quietly, profoundly, and indelibly. Weeks passed, and the boy continued to grow, steadier steps, more precise gestures, words formed with intention, and an increasing ability to explore independently. Morty celebrated each milestone quietly, savoring the steady rhythm of small triumphs. He recognized that these understated achievements were far more meaningful than any grand gesture, forming a foundation of trust, curiosity, and understanding that would endure beyond immediate perception. Life, in its quiet repetition, had taken on a luminous consistency, shaping character and confidence alike. One afternoon, beneath the old oak, the child experimented with small objects, arranging them with concentration and delight. The grandfather observed quietly, offering gentle commentary on patience and attentiveness. The boy laughed, Morty smiled softly, and for a brief, luminous moment all three existed in a shared, suspended calm. It was in these understated instances that connection revealed itself fully, not through spectacle or drama, but through consistent presence, attentiveness, and love expressed through repeated, deliberate acts. As night settled over the household, Morty remained by the crib, feeling the warmth and steady presence of the boy beside him. He whispered promises of continued care, guidance, and unwavering attention. Moonlight filtered gently across the floor, painting the room in pale, silvery patterns. Morty allowed himself to breathe deeply, reflecting on the lessons of patience, presence, and the quiet power of repeated acts of love. The child's soft breathing became a lullaby of reassurance, a reminder that life's most profound rhythms often exist in ordinary, unhurried moments. Finally, as the night deepened, Morty leaned back, letting the hush of the room enfold them both. Outside, stars traced slow paths across the sky. The quiet, steady pulse of life carried them through the night, a gentle reassurance that connection, love, and care could endure even when the world beyond seemed vast and unpredictable. He whispered a soft promise, knowing that the most profound stories are told not in endings or triumphs, but in the quiet accumulation of deliberate, loving attention. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's going to be okay, man. The morning arrived quietly, as if the world itself had decided to move in slow motion.
Sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting soft golden lines across the floor. Morty stirred first, glancing toward the crib where the boy slept peacefully, small breaths rising and falling in gentle rhythm. He knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. There was a luminous trust there, the result of months of quiet attentiveness, patience, and care. In that simple gaze, Morty felt the depth of connection that had grown between them, something steady, enduring, and unspoken. Breakfast was calm and deliberate. Soft bread, warm fruit, and a gentle cup of tea for Morty became part of a ritual they both cherished. The boy babbled and pointed, noticing the sunlight, the pattern of shadows, the movement of dust in the air. Morty responded, not as an instructor, but as a fellow observer of wonder, letting the boy's curiosity guide the flow of attention. Every small gesture, every subtle interaction formed a rhythm, a gentle pulse of shared life that was both ordinary and extraordinary in its quiet beauty. After breakfast, they stepped into the yard, where the scent of dew and wildflowers lingered softly in the air. The boy toddled confidently, exploring the soft earth with careful steps, occasionally pausing to examine a leaf or a stone. Morty followed closely, his presence steady and reassuring, offering guidance only when necessary. Each discovery, each stumble, each soft laugh became a lesson in patience, understanding, and the quiet art of being present. Morty marveled at how these ordinary moments had become extraordinary, shaping both of them in ways that were subtle, cumulative, and profound. Beneath the old oak, they paused again, letting sunlight filter through the branches in shifting patterns. The boy crouched, exploring roots and leaves, his tiny fingers tracing lines of bark and moss. Morty mirrored his motions, whispering observations and gentle encouragement. There was no rush, no pressure, only the quiet cadence of connection and curiosity. Morty reflected on how the child's confidence had grown, how gestures were deliberate, how attention lingered longer, and how wonder had become intertwined with understanding. Every small movement was a testament to the steady rhythm of life they had cultivated together. The grandfather arrived in the afternoon, carrying a bundle wrapped in soft cloth. Inside were small treasures, polished stones, a tiny bell, and a miniature carved animal. He laid them gently on the workbench, smiling at the boy who reached for them with bright, curious eyes.
"Every little thing carries a story," he said softly.
Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that teach us the most. Morty observed as the child explored each object carefully, discovering texture, shape, and color, learning not just about the items but about the art of noticing, patience, and gentle engagement. Afternoons were filled with quiet games, careful exploration, and deliberate learning. Morty guided the boy with soft encouragement, letting him experiment, make mistakes, and find solutions independently. Attention and curiosity were cultivated side by side, each small act forming a chain of learning that was invisible yet powerful. Morty saw the child's understanding deepen, his confidence grow, and his sense of joy expand with every discovery. These seemingly ordinary acts were quietly transformative, shaping a life rooted in care, presence, and trust. Evenings brought their familiar rituals. Bath time, soft pajamas, and the gentle tucking-in process were more than routine. They were moments of intimacy, reassurance, and reflection. Morty whispered stories, rivers that whispered to stones, clouds drifting lazily across the sky, stars moving silently in constellations of calm. The boy listened, absorbing not just the words but the rhythm, warmth, and deliberate attention behind them. Morty often lingered afterward, resting a hand lightly on the child's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of breath, and allowing the hush of the night to fill the room with peace. One night, a distant rumble of thunder stirred the boy briefly. Morty gathered him close, whispering nonsense words and soft reassurances, letting the storm become a gentle rhythm rather than a source of fear. The child's small fingers curled lightly around Morty's shirt, trusting and secure. Morty reflected on the significance of these moments. That love, patience, and consistency could build sanctuary and safety, shaping trust that would endure far beyond any fleeting storm. Weeks turned into months, and the boy continued to grow steadily. More deliberate steps, clearer gestures, emerging words, and a deeper curiosity for the world. Morty celebrated these milestones quietly, savoring the rhythm of small triumphs. He realized that the accumulation of gentle, consistent acts of care had created a foundation stronger than any dramatic event or sudden revelation could achieve. Life's beauty, he understood, resided in these quiet patterns in trust, attention, and connection carefully nurtured over time. One late afternoon beneath the oak, the boy experimented with small objects with concentration and delight. The grandfather observed silently, offering occasional gentle guidance. Morty watched the interaction, noticing the layers of learning, trust, and curiosity unfolding in subtle ways. Laughter, smiles, and quiet reflection intertwined, forming a tapestry of presence that needed no words to convey significance. It was in these understated moments that the deepest lessons were learned: patience, observation, understanding, and the power of deliberate care. Night fell slowly, wrapping the house in a tender hush. Morty lingered beside the crib, feeling the warmth, trust, and presence of the boy. He whispered promises of continued guidance, unwavering attention, and gentle love. Moonlight filtered through the window, painting silvery patterns across the floor, and Morty allowed himself to breathe deeply, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. He knew that love's most profound expressions were not dramatic or sudden, but subtle, repeated acts of care that formed a steady,
unbreakable foundation. Finally, he leaned back,
letting the room's quiet enfold them both. Outside, stars traced slow paths across the sky. The steady, unhurried rhythm of life carried them through the night, a gentle reminder that connection, trust, and love endure beyond all else. Morty whispered a final word of gratitude, knowing that the most lasting stories are not told in grand triumphs, but in small, deliberate, loving actions repeated day by day. And somewhere, he's still out there, watching, learning, and growing in quiet wonder, wrapped in the warmth of love and patience that has become his world. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's going to be okay, man.
The morning unfolded like a soft sigh, the sunlight gentle enough to brush the room without urgency. Morty moved quietly, careful not to disturb the boy who had already stirred, small fingers grasping the edge of the blanket as he explored the shapes of shadows on the floor. Morty knelt beside him, tracing a line along his cheek with a tender touch, feeling the quiet trust that had grown between them. Each morning had become a ritual of presence, a deliberate act of love expressed without words, but fully understood. Breakfast followed with gentle rhythm, warm bread, fruit, and soft sips of juice. The boy pointed at the dancing dust motes, at the sunlight spilling over the table, and at the flicker of leaves outside. Morty responded with soft commentary, observing alongside him, letting the child's curiosity guide the flow of attention. Every small gesture, every shared glance, became part of a growing tapestry of understanding. Morty realized that the most profound lessons were not taught with words, but demonstrated through steady, patient presence. They wandered into the yard, where dew still lingered on blades of grass, and the air carried a quiet freshness. The boy moved carefully, each step a deliberate choice, occasionally pausing to examine a leaf, a stone, or the curve of a flower petal. Morty followed close behind, hands ready to guide or catch, but mostly offering freedom to explore. Every stumble was met with gentle encouragement, every discovery with soft celebration. Morty understood that patience and attentive presence were more powerful than instruction or expectation, and that the child's growing confidence was a reflection of this steady care. Beneath the oak at the yard's edge, sunlight filtered through the branches in soft, shifting patterns. The boy crouched to explore roots and moss, fingers tracing lines of bark with intense curiosity. Morty mirrored his motions, whispering observations, commenting on textures, patterns, and shapes. There was no rush, no demand.
Only the deliberate rhythm of exploration and presence.
Morty observed how the child's attention had deepened, gestures had become deliberate, and curiosity had begun to blend seamlessly with understanding. Every ordinary moment felt extraordinary, a testament to steady love, care, and guidance. In the afternoon, the grandfather arrived, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were a few polished stones, a tiny bell, and a miniature carved figure. He laid them carefully on the workbench, smiling at the boy who reached eagerly with bright, fascinated eyes. "Every small thing carries a story," he said softly. "Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that teach us the most." Morty watched as the child explored each item carefully, discovering texture, shape, and color, learning through touch, observation, and curiosity rather than instruction. Afternoons were devoted to gentle games, quiet exploration, and deliberate learning. Morty guided the boy in arranging shapes, colors, or objects, sometimes side by side, sometimes allowing independent discovery. Mistakes were met with patience, curiosity was encouraged, and small triumphs were celebrated quietly. Morty noticed how the child's confidence and attention span had grown steadily, how curiosity had transformed into concentration, and how every small act of engagement strengthened the bond between them. These subtle routines formed a rhythm, a quiet pulse of love and growth that needed no outward recognition to feel profound. Evening brought the familiar rituals, bath time, soft pajamas, and careful tucking in. Morty whispered stories of rivers whispering to stones, clouds wandering slowly across the sky, and stars tracing silent paths through constellations. The boy listened attentively, absorbing the words, the tone, and the steady care behind them. Morty often lingered afterward, hand resting lightly on the child's chest, feeling the rise and fall of each breath, letting the calm of the night settle around them both. In these quiet moments, he understood the profound nature of presence. That steady attention, repeated day after day, could shape safety, trust,
and love in ways that were invisible but enduring. One night, distant thunder stirred the boy awake.
Morty gathered him close, murmuring gentle nonsense and soft reassurances until the child relaxed, fingers curling lightly into his shirt. The storm passed quietly outside, a rhythm rather than a threat, and Morty reflected on the importance of these moments. That trust, patience, and consistent care could create sanctuary, a refuge from uncertainty, and a quiet space in which growth and understanding could flourish. Weeks passed, and the boy's steps became more confident, gestures more intentional, words clearer, and curiosity sharper. Morty celebrated each milestone quietly, savoring the subtle triumphs, the unfolding of attention, and the emergence of understanding. He recognized that the accumulation of small, consistent acts of care had created a foundation stronger than any grand or dramatic moment could achieve. Life, in its quiet, steady repetition, had become luminous, meaningful, and profoundly satisfying. One afternoon beneath the oak, the boy experimented with a small set of objects, arranging them carefully, laughing softly at the patterns he created. The grandfather observed silently, offering gentle reminders about patience and the quiet power of observation. Morty watched the interaction, feeling the depth of learning, trust, and curiosity unfolding in understated ways. It was here, in the simplest of shared moments, that the most enduring lessons were learned: patience, attentiveness, understanding, and the steady nurturing of connection. Night fell softly, draping the room in gentle shadows. Morty remained beside the crib, feeling the warmth and presence of the child, whispering promises of continued guidance, care, and unwavering love. Moonlight poured through the window, painting silver patterns across the floor. Morty breathed deeply, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here and the lessons learned along the way. That love is expressed in the quietest acts, that presence and patience are more powerful than spectacle, and that trust grows strongest when nurtured gently and steadily over time. Finally, he leaned back, letting the hush of the night enfold them both. Outside, stars traced slow, deliberate paths across the sky. The rhythm of life, gentle and unhurried, carried them through the night. Morty whispered a soft word of gratitude, knowing that the most lasting stories are told not in grand endings or dramatic victories, but in small, deliberate acts of care, repeated day after day. And somewhere he's still out there, moving through the world in quiet wonder, learning, growing, and wrapped in the warmth of love and patience. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. The morning arrived wrapped in a gentle hush, the sunlight soft and unhurried as it spilled across the floor. Morty moved quietly, careful not to disturb the boy, who had already opened his eyes, small fingers reaching for the edges of the blanket. There was a slow, deliberate stretch, a faint yawn, and a glance that conveyed trust, curiosity, and comfort all at once. Morty knelt beside him, brushing a loose strand of hair from his forehead. In that simple motion, he felt the weight of months of care, patience, and presence, each small act building a foundation that neither time nor circumstance could erode. Breakfast was calm and familiar, a quiet ritual of warmth and sustenance. Soft bread, gentle fruit, and a bit of honey became more than food. They were markers of stability, moments of shared attentiveness, and small celebrations of everyday life. The boy pointed at sunlight flickering on the floor, at the movement of leaves outside, and at a shadow cast by a spoon. Morty responded softly, allowing observation to become shared wonder, noticing alongside him rather than instructing.
Every small interaction, every gentle smile,
reinforced the steady rhythm of trust that had developed between them, a rhythm that was now as reliable as sunrise. They ventured into the yard, where dew still lingered on blades of grass, sparkling faintly in the morning light. The boy toddled with a careful confidence, occasionally pausing to examine a leaf or the curve of a stone. Morty followed close behind, hands ready to guide, but mostly offering freedom to explore. Each stumble was met with calm reassurance, each success with quiet celebration. Morty recognized the beauty of these small, repeated actions that teaching, learning, and connection were found in the patient unfolding of experience, rather than in grand gestures or instruction. Beneath the old oak at the yard's edge, they paused once more. Sunlight filtered through the branches in shifting patterns. The boy crouched, fingers exploring roots and moss, tracing lines and textures with deliberate curiosity. Morty mirrored his motions, whispering gentle observations, commenting softly on shapes, textures, and the quiet poetry of nature. There was no rush, no pressure, only the steady, deliberate rhythm of exploration and shared presence. Morty marveled at how the child's confidence and attention had deepened, how curiosity had begun to merge seamlessly with understanding. Every ordinary movement now held extraordinary significance, a testament to trust, love, and care practiced steadily over time. The grandfather arrived in the afternoon, carrying a small wooden box. Inside were smooth stones, a tiny bell, and a carved miniature animal. He laid them gently on the workbench, smiling as the boy reached eagerly, eyes wide with fascination. "Every small thing has a story," he said softly. "Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that teach the most." Morty watched as the child explored carefully, discovering texture, color, and shape. It was a reminder that learning, observation, and attentiveness were as vital as any spoken lesson, and that wonder could be nurtured gently, day by day. Afternoons were filled with quiet play, deliberate learning, and gentle exploration. Morty guided the child through arranging shapes, patterns, or objects, occasionally side by side, sometimes allowing independence. Mistakes were met with patience, triumphs with understated celebration. Morty observed how curiosity had become focused attention, how confidence had grown, and how every interaction strengthened their bond. It was the accumulation of these ordinary yet deliberate acts that formed a rhythm, a subtle pulse of connection, care, and growth. Evening brought their familiar, cherished routines, bath time, soft pajamas, and the gentle act of tucking in. Morty whispered stories, rivers that whispered to stones, clouds drifting slowly across the sky, stars tracing quiet paths through constellations of calm.